On Monday, I gave you a video on how plant-based diets are actually terrible for your health and for human flourishing based on recent scientific studies. A viewer suggested in the comments for a video on how bad for the environment junk food is. And by junk food, I took that to mean processed and ultra-processed food, since that is never ever mentioned by any advocates for the environment. That's actually a pretty good idea, since we're always told that animal agriculture accounts for the overwhelming majority of the food industry's carbon and pollution output, and that water usage and all these other things are harmed by cows. A claim made when you have to factor in industrial agriculture feed production and do some creative accounting to get to. But industrialized processed foods never come into the question. So let's look at that question today. Just how much of pollution does processed food produce? Let's start with the definition of processed food, which will come from a BBC article from about a year ago. It's an article that claims that minimally processed foods, think frozen vegetables or pre-cooked rice, are better for the environment than locally produced vegetables and fruits bought locally and consumed locally. A claim that you don't have to look at data to see that just seems kind of silly on its face, and it's not really worth examining here. But that article goes into the processed food question, so it is relevant. And their definition for processed food is, quote, food can be divided into unprocessed or minimally processed, processed, and ultra-processed. Ultra-processed foods such as chips and cake accounts for just over half of the calories we consume. Unprocessed, locally sourced foods such as whole foods and vegetables have a relatively low carbon footprint. Research has also found that minimally processed vegetarian foods have among the lowest environmental impact. End quote. Here we're going to say minimally processed means things like packaged tomatoes from your local farmer's market or directly from the farmer. Now we turn to the BBC for this next because they have an interesting story related to all this. Headline: processed food conjures up images of giant resource guzzling factories. Hardly good for the planet. But could processing actually help reduce food's carbon footprint? Now the answer, of course, is no, but they won't say that, since the BBC relies on a lot of support from both the industrial food system and are also part of the push for centralizing the food system into the hands of very few people who can then dictate what the rest of us get to eat. But they do provide some good insight that helps make our point that processed foods are terrible for the environment any way you look at the issue. So from the BBC article, quote, one needs to look at how processing adds a step that you'd otherwise do, says Marco Springman, senior researcher on environmental sustainability and public health at the University of Oxford. If you process some food at home, the chances are you expend more energy doing that, as the process isn't as streamlined as a big factory. What about all the resources and energy needed to make all the ingredients in ultra-processed food? The sustainability of a food depends on how much energy goes into processing, storing, preserving, and refrigerating it, and how much of it we waste, says Shelley Miller, associate professor at the University of Michigan's School for Environmental Sustainability. It's therefore the type of ingredient rather than the number of ingredients, or whether it's processed or not, that drives the environmental impact of a food, she says. Ultra-processed foods, which are made mostly from substances extracted from foods, have mostly low-impact ingredients. That includes the fats and other preservatives used to help food storage. Processed foods broadly look pretty sustainable, but that's more indicative of their ingredients as opposed to processing itself, says Michael Clark, a researcher at Nuffield Health's Department of Population Health. However, one paper published last year points out that any ultra-processed foods containing palm and soy oils have, quote, substantial negative environmental effects, end quote. All sounds pretty good until the article loses the plot and mentions how bad animal agriculture supposedly is. And they ignore the fact that animal agriculture accounts for only 5% of emissions total in North America. What they address here is good to remember. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, corn and soy are on the top 10 list for crops produced in the United States. The chemicals sprayed on these crops are part of an industrial pesticide and fertilizer industry with a combined worth That's an estimated 287 billion US dollars in 2021. And this is why the Lancet Planetary Health Journal at thelancet.com points out that there's just an enormous hole in the research on the environmental impact of processed food. From the article, quote, ultra-processed foods, UPFs, as designed by the NOVA classification, are industrial food and drink formulations made of food-derived substances and additives, often containing little or no whole foods. Typical examples of UPFs are biscuits and confectionery, chicken nuggets, sugar-sweetened beverages, margarine, and many ready-made meals. The purpose of ultra-processing is, quote, to create branded, convenient, here meaning durable, ready to consume, attractive, meaning hyper-palatable, and highly profitable, meaning low-cost ingredients, food products, often designed to displace all other food groups. The rapid global growth in UPF, ultra-processed food, consumption means that there is an urgent need to scrutinize the health and environmental impacts of UPFs. Although evidence that UPFs are harmful to health is accumulating, we know little about the environmental impacts of ultra-processed foods, and what, if any, role they should play in the transition to sustainable diets. We identify several ways that ultra-processing should be considered when estimating environmental and health impacts of diets. Many UPFs contain palm and soy oils, which have substantial negative health and environmental effects. However, the environmental impact of UPFs go beyond the immediate resources used in the production of their ingredients. In previous work, such as the Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems, the environmental impacts of diets are based on the effects of the production and demand of agricultural commodities. Environmental impacts of processed foods are poorly quantified, considering only the effects of the primary commodities used for their production, i.e. vegetable oil and refined sugar. It is imperative that environmental considerations of diets capture the overall impact of UPFs from farm to fork, including the stages of processing, packaging, and distribution. End quote. Look, it's pretty well known that the palm oil industry and sugar industry have horrific environmental track records, with wildlife habitats destroyed by those agricultural processes, not to mention the emissions caused by the work. But they don't come under the same level of scrutiny that meat does, for unknown reasons, since we all know properly raised livestock actually regenerates the land that the animals are grazed on, land that is not suitable for farming anyway, the vast majority of the time. I mean, if you've ever actually seen cow pastures and like where I live, you're not growing anything on those land except grass. Clearly this area of inquiry is not being looked at closely enough, probably because those who fund such research would stand to lose enormously if the truth ever came out. Now, the Lancet article does a good job here of piercing the veil and getting to the bottom of this question by putting together the industrial components of the processed food system. From the article, quote, established methods should specifically address ultra-processing in their estimations, highlighting differential impacts compared with minimally processed food. The life cycle assessment method is the most commonly used method to investigate the environmental impacts of food. This method can take into account all parts of the supply chain, including agriculture, processing, waste, retail, transport, and household use. However, existing evaluations of the environmental impact effects do not consider industrial processes in a large variety of components, meaning food additives, that these processes add to foods. For example, ultra-processed foods use extensive packaging, which is a major source of environmental waste production with pan-global disposal impacts. The packaging has also been postulated to contain compounds with nasty disruptor properties such as bisphenol A. Ultra-processed foods also contain many authorized but often controversial food additives with potential dual detrimental impacts on the environment and health. Similarly, these foods encourage overeating, which can be a driver of diet-related disease and environmental harm, distorting global markets and driving land use change. Approaches to environmental impact assessment of food should go beyond using data sources of conventional food group aggregation and prioritize using food ultra-processing classifications most relevant to human health, such as NOVA. Estimations of the environmental impact of food processing should take into account that ultra-processed foods are necessarily produced by large transnational corporations. The power of transnational corporations means they can dictate where and what is grown, produced, marketed, and sold in food systems globally. They can use aggressive marketing to drive up demand and create new food cultures, construct global supply chains to obtain cheap ingredients, and use extensive packaging that encourages mass production, long-distance transportation, and waste related to their consumption. The majority of junk foods or discretionary foods, meaning foods not necessary to human diet, are categorized as ultra-processed. Additionally, many of them, such as ultra-processed bread or yogurt, can be easily replaced by their minimally processed counterparts. The discretionary nature of ultra-processed foods means that the environmental impacts of new food cultures created by transnational corporations could be entirely avoidable. The raw agricultural ingredients and other planetary resources currently deployed to produce ultra-processed foods could otherwise contribute to a healthy diet that promotes population health and equity in food security, while reducing environmental impact from food production. End lengthy quote. They also don't mention there that if they have all the resources to do all of that, then these transnational corporations also have the resources to dictate where studies go. Now, once you factor in all the aspects of the ultra-processed food industry, you do see something pretty obvious. They are far worse for the environment than meat. A cow eats mostly grass until the last year of its life and is fed a grain, soy, corn mix on a huge industrial ranch somewhere for that last year, then is taken to slaughter. And that's just conventional beef. Grain finish means that the animal is fed some mix of grains from the last 6 months or less of its life, allowing it to be labeled grass-fed, grain-finished. In grass-finished, cows eat only grass and whatever else they find randomly in the field. Any of those varieties of beef I listed are then taken to slaughter, maybe a great distance away, meaning there are transportation issues, and then processed and shipped to retailers, again, possibly at great distance. None of that sounds anywhere near as environmentally detrimental as the ultra-processed food industry, but we simply lack the data to make the case either way, and I think that's by design. So I can't help you with raw data about how bad the industrial food system is because the data set simply does not exist. But we can look at the problem logically. When we do it, it becomes obvious that if anyone actually cares about the environment, the way they always profess when they tell us that meat is bad, then the last thing they'd be pushing on people are processed foods made with soy, palm oil, corn, and chemical additives that cause overeating, transformation of agricultural spaces and the environment broadly. Of course, that probably won't happen because none of this is actually about the environment. It's about two things, folks. It's always about two things: money and power. But you knew that already. What happens when you centralize food into the hands of very few people? Let me know what you think of all of this in the comments. What did you think of the impact of these foods on the environment? Again, let me know your thoughts. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. It really does help. Share this on social media if you can. That helps enormously as well. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for watching today.